Okay, and I also want to mute all, but I can't do that now. But it's okay. All right, so we left off here on page 105 in the Koran edition, or it is, where is the page number here? 18b of Baba Batra. Okay. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So just one paragraph before, the rabbis hold that the responsibility falls on the one who causes damage to distance himself. The one who has the potential to cause damage must act to prevent the damage from occurring. This is the halacha, even if his initial placement was done in accordance with halacha, as in the case where one bought part of a field. So we're talking about the placement of a pit or planting a tree and how far it has to be from the neighbor's property. But what if you inherit or buy a portion of a field and you have the right to put something in your field? Can you do those same distance laws apply? And yes, according to Ravina, who's among the last generation of rabbis from the period of the Talmud, that he says that's the case. Always have to distance your potential damage-causing property, a tree with its roots or a pit that could overflow or could leak. Things like that have to be away from your neighbor's property. So this is where we pick up now. The Gemara asks, does this prove by inference that Rabbi Yosei, who disagrees with the ruling of the rabbis, holds that the responsibility falls on the one whose property was damaged to distance himself, that is, to avoid being damaged? So there's that also. But if the responsibility to distance oneself falls on the one whose property was damaged, even in the case of water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, the owner should also not have to distance himself. Why does Rabbi Yosei distinguish between that situation and the case of bees and mustard, which we saw before as well? Somebody has mustard, somebody has bees. You want to, there are lots of examples of property that could potentially be damaging to neighbor's property. Rather, actually, Rabbi Yosei holds that the responsibility to distance oneself falls on the one who causes damage, even if he did not act improperly. And this is what Rabbi Yosei is saying to the rabbis. Your explanation works out well with regard to water in which flax is steeped and vegetables where the one who causes damage must distance himself, as these damage those. But those do not damage these. That is, the water in which flax is steeped damages the vegetables, but the vegetables do not damage the water. But in the case of mustard and bees, they both damage one another. In light of this factor, and since the initial planting of the mustard was permitted, the owner of the bees should distance them from the mustard. And there's a background here about mustard and bees. The mustard plant is a honey plant found throughout Eretz Yisrael. Its colorful flowers are attractive to bees. Honeybees can bite off parts of the mustard plant's leaves and flowers. Although bees might bite off parts of the mustard plant, they cause minimal damage to the leaves relative to the damage caused by birds and insects. As for the seeds, they are inaccessible to bees, as stated here. Okay, so there's a bee on a mustard plant. So I don't know what the honey tastes like. If like here, there's orange blossom honey, there's clover honey, but I don't know about mustard honey.
Wait, isn't there? Don't they market something called honey mustard?
Yes.
There's honey mustard, right?
Just
But mustard honey, right?
Ravina puts the words this way, but Yossi
Right.
puts the words
That's
this way.
right. That's right. And as for the rabbis, how do they respond to this claim? They maintain that bees do not damage mustard. Their reasoning is that if it is referring to a seed, the bees will not find it. It's referring to a leaf, If it is referring to a leaf, it'll grow back, and therefore no damage has been caused. So bees don't damage mustard. The Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yossi hold that the responsibility falls on the one who causes damage to distance himself? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah coming up on 25b that Rabbi Yossi says even though the cistern preceded the tree, the owner need not cut down the tree, as this one digs a cistern in his property and that one plants the tree in his property. Right? So the debate's going to go on for a long time about individual owners have the right to do whatever they want on their property versus the idea that you always have to keep in mind your neighbors, the damage that what you do on your property could theoretically cause to your neighbor. It's like when we built our building here in Olney, a neighbor behind our property demanded to the Park and Planning Commission that we have our stormwater management system underground. If we only had a pond, an above ground pond, then that owner claimed that a once in a lifetime or once in a century storm could fill up the pond, overflow into his property. The Park and Planning Commission agreed with that owner and forced us to spend much more money to build an underground stormwater management system. So that's so even though we have the right to do the minimal amount that's required for any builder or any building to have stormwater management, we had to go above and beyond because of a neighbor's complaint. So the idea that rabbis are talking about is the same idea. How much do we have to take into account our neighbor's property? How much do we say, well, to hell with our neighbor, we have the right to do whatever we want? Doesn't matter, our neighbor has a cistern and the tree that I'm planting might have roots that will grow into my neighbor's property and possibly break apart the cistern. Too bad. He should have thought of that when building when digging the cistern, that tree roots might damage it. Yeah.
What about the obverse if the neighbor gets a unthought of benefit, such as if the neighbor A plants an apple tree on his property and the apples fall onto the property of neighbor B.
Oh.
Whose apples are they?
Whose apples are they? Right. Yes. So that, I think that's a different question, and I don't know the answer to that. But the rabbis will discuss that question at some point.
I have no doubt.
Right. So there's also, let's say you have an oak tree, and it's the fall, and those damn oak leaves are falling on your property. Do you get your neighbor to pay for collecting those leaves off of your property because they're from his tree, or because they fell on your property, you have to collect them? So, right. So hold that thought for probably October. Next year or the year after when we'll get to that. Rather, actually, Rabbi Yossi holds that the responsibility falls on the one whose property was damaged to distance himself, and Rabbi Yossi spoke to the rabbis in accordance with their statement. The Gemara elaborates. What's that? The Gemara elaborates. Rabbi Yossi was saying to the rabbis, in my opinion, the responsibility falls on the one whose property was damaged to distance himself. And therefore, even in the case of water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, the owner of the water need not distance himself. But according to your opinion that the responsibility falls on the one who causes damage to distance himself, this works out well with regard to water in which flax is steeped and vegetables, as these damage those, and those do not damage these. But mustard and bees both damage one another, and if the mustard owner acted properly, the owner of the bees should be required to move his bees. But I don't know how far bees fly, and I don't know whether there is a reasonable distance for bees from neighbors' property where the flowers are. Yeah.
How does the owner distance himself?
So what you have to
Discuss
move.
The item.
You have to move the pit or the laundry vat or
Okay.
the flax vat
Okay.
more than 3 handbreadths away.
Of the cistern.
Yes, right. So,
It makes some
well, it's
intuitive
a-
sense.
yes, so
Either one could damage the other, both have a responsibility.
that's according to the rabbis, but Rabbi Yossi says no.
No, yeah.
This is the same Rabbi Yossi who said that that chicken is parv. So so we shouldn't sneeze at Rabbi Yossi and just say, "Who is this guy?" He has some interesting opinions that sometimes it's a shame that the rabbis did not follow.
Disagreed with.
If
Chicken
only
parmesan.
chicken were parv, right? The recipes that could be Jewish recipes. Anyway,
Yes.
so. So that the more people that we have next to me here,
sorry.
the more funny things are going on. But the beauty of the Talmud is maintaining these opinions. Even though the rabbis say the owner has to consider the neighbor's property, there is a reasonable ethical counter to that by saying no. Your property is property, and you can do whatever you want on your property. Maybe Yosei would have a limit to that, like you're allowed to blare music so loud into your neighbor's property. Okay, so we'll see. The Gemara continues. And how did the rabbis respond to this claim? They hold that bees do not damage mustard. If this is referring to a seed, the bees will not find it. If it's referring to a leaf, it'll grow back. Okay, so the Mishnah teaches, red S, different topic. Now, nor may one set up a launderer's pond near his neighbor's wall unless he distances it 3 handbreadths from the wall, right? Because the water, if it's any closer, the water could come out and could damage the wall. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says they taught this only with regard to a soaking pond in which soiled clothes are left to soak for several days. But in the case of a washing pond where clothes are actively cleaned, 4 cubits are required. Okay, so active sloshing of the water, then you need 4 cubits, which is 6 feet, as opposed to 3 handbreadths, which is maybe a foot or 2/3 of a foot, something like that, if it's just left to soak. So there's not much sloshing going on there. That opinion is also taught in a Baraita. A launderer's pond must be kept 4 cubits from one neighbor's wall. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah that one must keep a distance of only 3 handbreadths? Rather must one not conclude from the Baraita that the statement of Rav Nachman is correct? And some raise this as a contradiction and present the Mishnah and Baraita as apparently conflicting sources. We learned in the Mishnah that a launderer's pond must be kept 3 handbreadths from his neighbor's property. But isn't it taught in a Baraita that 4 cubits are required? Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says this is not difficult. Here, the Mishnah is referring to a soaking pond, which requires 3 handbreadths. There, the Baraita is referring to a washing pond, in which case 4 cubits are necessary. Rav Chia, son of Rav Avya, teaches the Mishnah explicitly as reading, unless he distanced 3 handbreadths from the rim of the soaking pond and the wall.
I have a question.
Yes, Steve?
We repeat it.
I'm assuming that if you follow the rules, let's say you have your soaking pond, whatever the rule is, greater than 3 widths, but damage still occurs for some reason, then you're not liable?
Right, that's right. It's we'll get into damages momentarily, but that's right. They're saying it's the normal course of activities that happen on people's property, and that one would expect that there could be some kind of damage happening So you have a launderer's pond in somebody's property, in your neighbor's property, you have to expect that water is going to overflow. So, and the owner of the pond or the cistern or the tree or whatever it is that could cause damage has to, according to Gemara, has to have reasonable responsibility to prevent damage. So the rabbis want to ensure that people have the right to build whatever they want on their property, but at the same time understand that that we are building community, and that we're building a community that is based on the idea of always caring about your neighbor, whether it's your literal neighbor or your fellow Jew. So the law could be such that it could encourage narcissists, well, not narcissists, people who are just only concerned for themselves and could care less about anybody else around them. But that's not the Jewish way, and what the Talmud is teaching us so far is that you have to balance the idea of your right to do what you want to do on your property with the idea that you have to be concerned about potential damage to your neighbor. Okay, the Mishnah teaches that one who digs a pit must distance it 3 handbreadths from another's property and plaster it with lime. A dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the precise wording of the Mishnah? Did we learn and plasters with lime, meaning that the walls must be plastered with lime in addition to distancing the pit 3 handbreadths? Or perhaps we learned or plasters with lime, that is, one may plaster the walls with lime instead of digging the pit at a distance of 3 handbreadths. And this is interesting because the letter vav before a word, which usually means and, can in some circumstances mean or. That's why the rabbis are asking this question. So do you have to move it 3 handbreadths and also plaster it with lime, or can you do either one? So the Gemara answers, it's obvious that we learned and plasters with lime, as if it enters your mind that we learned or plasters with lime, which is the same as what is stated in the clause of the Mishnah discussing olive refuse. If so, let the Tana combine them and teach them together. If the same halacha applied in all circumstances, all of the Mishnah's cases could be taught together. The Gemara answers, this is not proof, as perhaps these cases are taught separately because this type of damage is not similar to that type of damage. The first clause of the Mishnah addresses the issue of damage due to moisture, and whereas the last clause addresses the issue of damage due to heat. Right? The compost material, like olive refuse, creates heat. The cistern with water in it, moisture. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraita. Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to rock that is so soft it crumbles in one's hands, this one digs his pit from here on his property, and that one digs his pit from there. This one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime, and that one distances his pit 3 handbreadths and plasters with lime. The Gemara analyzes this ruling. The specific reason one must plaster with lime is that he is using rock that, excuse me, that he is using rock that crumbles in one's hands, from which it may be inferred that if it is rock that does not crumble in one's hands, one would not be required to plaster with lime as well. So I don't know I'm not a mechanical engineer. I don't know what building cisterns and different kinds of rock entails, but it seems to make sense that different requirements, cisterns would require different requirements for different kind of soil. The Gemara answers, one could say that the same is true. That is, that even though he is using rock that does not crumble in one's hands, he must also plaster with lime. And it was necessary for the Tana to mention the case of rock that crumbles in one's hands, as it might enter your mind to say that since it crumbles in one's hands, let's require a greater distance. Therefore, the Tana teaches us that this is not the case. The Mishnah teaches that one must distance the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, and animal manure, and salt, and lime, and rocks, 3 handbreadths from the wall of another, or plaster its receptacle with lime. The Gemara comments, we learned in a Mishnah there, in Tractate Shabbat, with what substances may one insulate a pot of cooked food on Shabbat Eve, and with what substances may one not insulate it. One may insulate the pot neither with the solid residue of produce that has been pressed free of its oil, nor with manure, nor with salt, nor with lime, nor with sand, whether those materials are moist or whether they are dry. All of these materials spontaneously generate heat when piled up for an extended period of time. Therefore, they add heat to the pot they insulate. So in other words, the Shabbat concern is cooking. You just want to warm, you're allowed to warm something on Shabbat. You're not allowed to heat it to the extent that it might cook it. So these things might not just be insulation, they actually might be heat generating. The Gemara asks, what's different here that the Mishnah teaches the halacha in the case of rocks, and it does not teach the halacha in the case of sand? And what's different there that it teaches the halacha in the case of sand, and it does not teach the halacha in the case of rocks? Thank you, Bess. Rav Yosef says there is a practical reason for this difference. Rocks are not mentioned there because it's not customary for people to insulate food with rocks. Abaye said to him, and is it customary for people to insulate food with wool fleece and tabs of purple wool? As it's taught in a Baraita, one may insulate food with wool fleece, with combed wool clumps, which are unwoven, with tabs of purple wool, and with swatches of soft material, but when one may not move them on Shabbat because they are muktzah. They are set aside. How is it? How are these things muktzah? I don't know. Rather, Abaye said that the Tana follows the biblical aphorism in the verse that states, its neighbor tells about him. That is, one example is mentioned and the same applies to the other case. In other words, so its neighbor tells about him is used here by the rabbis as a deductive tool. So you bring an example that's supposed to highlight other examples that are related to it. He taught the halacha in the case of rocks here, and the same is true of sand. He taught the halacha in the case of sand there, and the same is true of rocks. Rava said to Abaye, if this is correct, that its neighbor tells about him, let him teach the halacha of all these examples in one case, and let him teach the halacha of just one in the other case. And it can be said that the same is true with regard to the others. Rather, Rava said, this is the reason that the Tana does not teach the halacha in the case of rocks, because they break, that is, scratch the pot. And consequently, people do not use them for insulating food at all. Here, this is the reason that the Tana does not teach the halacha in the case of sand, because it heats hot items and cools cold items, and therefore it does not cause any damage to the wall. So sand is a neutral thing. It doesn't heat. It keeps hot things hot, and it keeps cold things cold, and it doesn't damage walls. The Gemara asks, but Rabbi Oshaya taught in a Baraita that one must distance sand from his neighbor's wall. The Gemara answers, there it's referring to damp sand, which must be kept at a distance due to its moisture. The Gemara challenges, let the Tana of our Mishnah also teach the halacha in the case of sand, and we will interpret it as referring to damp sand. The Gemara answers, this Tana already taught the case of a water channel, which is a source of dampness, and therefore there was no need to mention damp sand as well. Well, I'd argue with that because I'm not sure that damp sand is similar to a water channel. But Okay, the Gemara rejects this answer. That is incorrect. As is that to say that the Mishnah includes only one example of a source of dampness? Doesn't the Mishnah teach the case of a water channel? And yet it also teaches the example of a launderer's pond. This demonstrates that the Mishnah teaches many cases, despite the similarity between them. And therefore it should have mentioned the halacha in the case of sand as well. The Gemara answers, both of those particular examples are necessary. As, had the Tana taught only the case of a water channel, one would have claimed that a distance must be kept because it is fixed. That is, water constantly passes through it. But with regard to a launderer's pond, which is not fixed, as it sometimes holds water and sometimes does not, one might say that one need not distance it from his neighbor's property. And conversely, had the Tana taught only the case of a launderer's pond, one might have said that this must be distanced because its water is fixed and standing in one location and therefore leaks out. But with regard to a water channel, one might say distancing is not required. Consequently, it's necessary to state both examples. By contrast, including the halach in the case of sand would not add any novel understanding. Yeah.
Doesn't the soaking pond become a washing pond after it's finished soaking?
I would imagine that if you're soaking dirty laundry, then it's soaking and the water becomes dirty. So you wouldn't want to wash the clothes in that dirty water. So you'd have another pond to put it in. It's like before they had rinse cycles, you had to have separate things of water.
So people brought their clothes to a soaking person and then they took them home and brought them to a...
I have no idea. I thought people just washed their clothes in the river. So
I don't know how many rivers there are in Israel we're talking about.
Well, okay, but in Babylonia there are. So I don't know. I really don't know how washing took place, and I don't know if there are sources, written sources, that explain how washing is done.
Got to take the water out of the soaking pond once it's got dirty from 3-4 days.
I would imagine so, and then refill it. Yes. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard work being a launderer. The Mishnah teaches one must distance seeds, that is, one may not plant seeds, and one may not operate the plow, and one must eliminate urine 3 handbreadths from the wall of another. The Gemara asks, why is it necessary to mention seeds? Let him derive this requirement to distance the seeds due to the requirement to distance a plow, as in any event the ground must be plowed before it can be sown. The Gemara answers, this is referring to planting with a single hand motion, which is performed without plowing. The Gemara further challenges, the Mishnah teaches that one must distance a plow, but let him derive this requirement to distance a plow due to the requirement to distance the seeds, as plowing is preparation for planting. The Gemara answers, this is referring to one who plows to prepare the ground for trees. The Gemara challenges, but if so, let him derive this requirement to distance a plow due to the requirement to distance the water. If there are trees, there must be a water channel to irrigate them, and arranging one's field in such a manner should be prohibited for that reason. The Gemara answers, the Tana is referring to Eretz Yisrael, concerning which it is written, and drinks water as the rain of heaven comes down. In Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, water channels were not needed. That is, right, Deuteronomy 11, I think, is about the chapter that if you follow in God's ways, the rain will come at the right time, and you don't have to worry about irrigating. If you don't follow in God's ways, then the rain comes at the wrong time or doesn't come at all. So the Gemara asks, is this to say that seeds take root to the sides, that is, the growing roots spread sideways and cause damage to walls? But then we learn in a Mishnah with regard to one who bends a branch of a grapevine into the ground so that it strikes roots and produces a new vine. You see a picture of that here. If it does not have 3 handbreadths of earth over it, he may not plant a seed above it, as he would thereby transgress the prohibition of diverse kinds. And it is so you're not allowed to plant 2 different things in the same row. And it's taught with regard to this Mishnah, but one may plant on either side of that bent branch. This indicates that there is no concern that the roots of the seeds will spread out sideways. Rabbi Chaga says in the name of Rabbi Yosei, the issue here is not that the roots will spread out sideways and reach the wall. Rather, it's prohibited to plant seeds near one's neighbor's property because they break up the ground and cause loose soil to rise up, which damages the foundation of the wall. The Mishnah teaches, and urine must be kept at a distance of 3 handbreadths from the wall of one's neighbor. Rabbah Bar Chana says it is permitted for a person to urinate alongside the wall of another, as it is written, and I will cut off from Ahab those who urinate against the wall, and him that is shut up, and him that is left at large in Israel. As the verse employs the term those who urinate against the wall to mean males, it seems that urinating against the wall was a common practice. The Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that urine must be kept at a distance of 3 handbreadths from the wall? The Gemara answers there, the Mishnah is referring to urine that is poured from a chamber pot, as opposed to urine that is passed from the body. The Gemara suggests, come in here, Baraita. A person may not pour water at the side of the wall of another unless he distances the water 3 handbreadths from it. If pouring water is prohibited, then all the more so should urination be prohibited. The Gemara explains, there too it's referring to urine that is poured from a chamber pot. The Gemara suggests, come and hear another proof from a Baraita. A person may not urinate alongside the wall of another unless he distances himself 3 handbreadths from it. In what case is this statement said? It's said in the case of a brick wall. But in the case of a stone wall, one must distance himself enough so that it does not cause damage. And how far must he distance himself? 1 handbreadth. And if there is hard rock present, it is permitted to urinate there. The Gemara comments, the refutation of the opinion of Rabbah Bar Chana is a conclusive refutation, and his ruling is rejected. The Gemara asks, but Rabbah Bar Chana stated a verse in support of his opinion. How can the Baraita rule counter to what is written in a verse? The Gemara answers, this is what it is saying there. That is, this is the meaning of that verse. I will not even leave Ahab something whose manner is to urinate against a wall. And what is that? A dog. According to this interpretation, the verse is not referring to people at all.
I'll remember this the next time.
Yes, so when we get to that, when we're reading the Book of Kings, oh yeah, we're talking about a dog, not people. Or when you want to urinate against the wall. I got it, yes. Yes.
You know how they stopped that in Rouen? Men who were urinating against the wall. So they built an angle so when it splashed back, they made it so that.
Those smart French.
So happy to know that.
Yes, that's a good trivia item.
Of course, what about when you're...
It's hard to work into a conversation.
You know, that's totally
knowledge
a totally separate trivia item was in Pearls and Swine, the comic strip in the Washington Post this morning about how Abraham Lincoln's son was saved from drowning by John Wilkes Booth's brother.
Ooh.
So I don't know if you believe everything that you read in the comic strips, but isn't that interesting and fascinating?
Yes.
Like a Twilight Zone kind of thing.
Entwined.
Yes, that's right. Rabbi Tovi Bar Kisna says that Shmuel says, a wafer does not reduce the dimensions of a widow.
Window.
Of a window, yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm seeing window, and I said widow. Yes, a wafer does not reduce the dimensions of a window. That is, when a corpse or a significant part thereof is in one room, its impurity can spread to a room adjacent to it if there is a window of a certain size between the rooms. Shmuel states that when one puts a wafer in a window, the wafer is not considered an obstruction, so the size of the opening as relevant to this halacha remains the same. Okay, so just a reminder that impurity resulting from contact with a corpse is the most extensive kind of impurity in that it doesn't even involve touching. It involves being in the same room or under the same roof as the corpse. And that would apply to airplanes, like a corpse is traveling in the luggage hold of an airline. If you're a Kohen, you need to worry about that if you want to stay in a state of ritual purity, because the impurity of the corpse goes through the floor of the passenger department. Same as in a building, same as in a house. So we're talking about a time, ancient times, it was common for people to die at home, and the home, what that would mean is that everybody in the house would become immediately impure. And if this is in the time of when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, it's an issue because you'd have to then become purified through the bizarre ceremony that the Torah describes of purification. So anyway, to try to avoid the impurity of the corpse, might it be okay for the corpse to be in one room, and if there isn't a window between the rooms, maybe the impurity doesn't spread. So maybe I'm wrong about impurity in a building, that the impurity rises between floors. But so if there's a window, then the impurity spreads through the window, and the obstruction that's the size of a wafer is not enough to keep the impurity out. The Gemara asks, why discuss specifically this case? Why does Shmuel teach this halacha with regard to a wafer? Even a thick chunk of bread also does not reduce the dimensions of a window. The Gemara answers, Shmuel is speaking utilizing the style of it is not necessary, as follows. It is not necessary to state this halacha with regard to thick bread. Since it's fit for him to consume, he does not nullify it. That is, he does not plan to leave it in the window for an extended amount of time. But in the case of a wafer, which becomes disgusting when placed in a window, I might say that he does nullify it and becomes part of the house, thereby reducing the size of the window. To counter this, Shmuel teaches us that even a wafer is not nullified, as it can be used to feed animals, as one is not particular about their food. Therefore, the wafer does not become part of the window in which it is placed. The Gemara challenges, and let him derive this halacha from the fact that a wafer is an item that is susceptible to ritual impurity, and any item that is susceptible to impurity does not serve as a barrier against the spread of impurity. The Gemara explains this is referring to a wafer that was kneaded in fruit juice, which is not one of the liquids that renders food susceptible to ritual impurity, and therefore the wafer is not susceptible to ritual impurity. Consequently, one might have thought that it serves as a barrier before ritual impurity and reduces the dimensions of the window.
Wait a minute.
Yeah?
But if isn't everything that's in the same room as a body ritually impure? We're talking about pots that have lids and pots that don't have lids, right?
Yes, it depends what the pot is made of,
Right.
and also depends what's in the pot at the time.
Okay.
What liquids are susceptible and what liquids aren't susceptible.
I'm trying to remember.
So I
It talks
don't.
about the liquids. I don't think it talks in the Torah about what the liquids are.
So I'm not sure, and I'm not up on laws of ritual purity because really it doesn't apply today. But so I don't know.
Because I just thought in the Torah it just says whatever's in the room gets.
I think it does mention some liquids there that can become impure, but I just don't remember.
I don't remember.
The Gemara raises an objection to Shmuel's opinion from a Mishnah in Ohalot. Ohalot means tents, and it's that tractate deals with impurity of a corpse that is in a tent. With regard to a basket that is full of straw, or an earthenware barrel full of dried figs, which are placed in a window, one considers, If the straw or dried figs would stand on their own, were the basket or barrel removed, then they would serve as a barrier against the spread of impurity. But if they would not stand on their own, they would not serve as a barrier. The Gemara explains the objection. But why should the straw or dried figs serve as a barrier? Even straw that can stand on its own is fit for feeding to one's animal and will likely be removed from the opening, which means it should not be considered part of the window. The Gemara answers, the ruling of the Mishnah is stated with regard to rotted straw, which is unfit for animal consumption. The Gemara asks, but if it's fit for use in the making of clay for bricks, but it is fit for use in making clay for bricks. The Gemara answers, this is referring to straw that has thorns in it, and therefore is not fit for making bricks. The Gemara challenges, even so, it is fit for kindling a fire. The Gemara answers that this is referring to wet straw. The Gemara responds, nevertheless, it's fit for kindling a large fire. If one builds a large fire, wet straw will not dry and will dry and become ignitable. The Gemara answers, a large fire is not common, and therefore in all likelihood the straw will remain in the window. The Gemara further asks, but dried figs are fit for him to consume, and he will certainly remove them. Consequently, they should not be considered fixed in their place. Shmuel says this is referring to a case where the figs became worm-infested. And so Rabbah bar Avu teaches this is referring to a case where the figs became worm-infested. The Gemara clarifies, what are the exact circumstances of this barrel that held the dried figs? If this is referring to a case where its opening faced outward, that is, not toward the source of ritual impurity, let the barrel itself serve as a barrier. It should not be susceptible to impurity in this case, as an earthenware vessel does not contract impurity if its exterior is opposed to impurity. Rather, one must say that its opening faces inward, and it is rendered impure because the impurity enters through its opening. And if you wish, say instead that actually its opening faces outward. And with what are we dealing here? We're dealing with a metal barrel, which does contract impurity through its exterior.
I don't understand how a barrel faces something. It's always up. The opening is
Unless it's
goes up.
stored on an incline.
Well,
and it pours out.
Not necessarily.
what-
You might
what
be
if
able
it's
to
like-
reach in better if it's inclined a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
or
Yeah.
a barrel that happens to be on its side.
Yeah, but again, just storing, so you could store less if it's on its side than if it's just slightly inclined when it's easier to reach in. The Gemara raises another objection to the assumption that an item for which there is use, that there is a use, does not reduce the dimensions of a window, even if it's not susceptible to impurity from a baraita, with regard to grass that one plucked and placed in a window, or that grew on its own in windows, and scraps of fabric that do not measure 3 by 3 finger breadths, and a limb or flesh dangling from an animal or a beast, and a bird resting in the window, and a Gentile sitting in a window, and a child born after 8 months of pregnancy, who is not expected to survive, that is placed in the window, and salt, and an earthenware vessel, and a Torah scroll. All these reduce the dimensions of the window. Consequently, impurity passes through only if there remains an open space of a square handbreadth. But with regard to snow, hail, frost, ice, and water, all these do not reduce the dimensions of a window. Let's just keep going and not think of the idea of putting an 8-month-old, a baby born after 8 months of pregnancy in a window. That's just bizarre, but again, the Gemara proceeds to challenge Shmuel's ruling from each of the cases of the Baraita. The Gemara asks, but according to Shmuel, who says that an item that has a use is not considered part of the window and does not reduce the dimensions of the space, grass is fit for consumption by one's animal, so it will not remain in the window. Yet the Baraita states that grass reduces the dimensions of the window. The Gemara answers this is referring to afrazda, which is poisonous grass that is unfit for an animal to consume. And here is a picture of afrazda, which seems to be oleander. There are various opinions with regard to the correct spelling and meaning of this term. Some commentaries identify it with the oleander, which is indeed poisonous, Some say it might be yellow iris. Others suggest that it's a species of plant containing a high concentration of oxalic acid, such as Oxalis pescapre or sourgrass, which is very common in Eretz Yisrael. It's harmful and possibly deadly to animals. Okay, so, and here's yellow iris, and here is sourgrass. Okay, so let's stop here for today. It's 10:17. I have to get ready for my next thing. And we will, next Sunday is our last class for the academic year. So I wish everybody, the women here who are mothers, a happy Mother's Day. And I'll stop sharing so we can see each other better. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.